Hi, I'm Adam Summer. You're listening to the Yerushalmi Talk podcast with the support of the Yeshivat Javar Yerushalayim in Har Nof, Jerusalem.
Halacha 3. On the phone with us today from the yeshiva is Rabbi David Gilbert, and we were just talking about the last amazing puzzle in this Yerushalmi. You have in in the last halacha 2, it ends off with this mysterious thing where the ending of it just ends with Rabbi Abba, who said he is given this name, Mahava, because he dislodges the hidden olives. And then it quotes from Shmuel 23:23, and it says in this very cryptic sugya, Rabbi Abahu said he is given this name because he dislodges the hidden olives, and the term Mahava denotes that which is concealed. As the verse states, observe and ascertain all the hidden places where he conceals himself. Yit Chava. And really, Yerushalmi is unique because it has a lot of puzzles in it, and it doesn't really hold your hand and walk you through the puzzles. It puts it out there to sharpen your mind. Rabbi Yochanan is always talking about in the Yerushalmi Shas about sharpening the student's mind. And if you're not clever enough to get it, you just read past it. But you have careful eyes, you'll see it. They're not accidental. They're not out of place. They don't need to be edited. This here is, where it was talking about special olive trees, and now it's talking about these hidden things. And what's amazing about that is all over the place, olive oil has to do with the wisdom. And you could read it as there's no other wisdom like Torah, right? You had regular trees, and now you have this special tree. Also, you could look at it in terms of the olive shoots. All over the place, you have olive shoots where it's talking about the son of Jesse and Mashiach and things like that. And it has to do with people that are righteous and going in a righteous direction. So these are talking about these either extra righteous people, or it's talking about, which is what I prefer, which is that it's talking about this hidden knowledge in Torah wisdom, and that you can only get access to this by hard work. But chapter in Halacha 3, we're going to get into another kind of aggadah. Now, in the last chapter, we could have done all of this with carob trees, and it would have sufficed. But no, Rabbi Yochanan and the editors of the Mishnah, they're putting this with the olive trees because there's a lot of hidden aggadah with it, and it's trying to show you, to somebody who's really careful in learning, that, hey, there's no other wisdom like it, and it takes hard work. Just like putting on these knee pads to get in and find these hidden olives, it's the same thing here where you're getting in and you're finding this hidden knowledge, just like what you and I are working on. And now we're going to get into grapes, right? So now you just had olives, and now it's getting into these things of grapes. But this is also not accidental. Now, the rest of this halacha is going to get into all sorts of aggadic things. So it's not out of place to say that, hey, wait a second, in the editing of, or the tradition of putting the olives and the grapes back to back, that is also going to be aggadic. And let me share with you something. So Rabbi Gilbert and I were learning Ruth Rabbah, Midrash Rabbah in Ruth, and at the end of it, where it's talking about how the Messiah is going to come, and the branch of King David is going to come, that it's talking about the blessing of Judah, and it's giving you a clue in the Mikra of what is the king supposed to be doing, what is the proper role of the king. Now here in Vayechi, in Bereshit, in chapter 48, 11 and 12, Jacob is giving a blessing to Judah, and this, by the way, is also echoed and explained in the explanation of the Mikra in the Midrash Rabbah Ruth at the end of it. And he says, he will launder his garments in wine and his robe in the blood of grapes, red-eyed from wine and white-toothed from milk. And how this is explained in the Midrash is as follows. It says that basically the role of the king of Israel is that he's supposed to immerse himself in Torah study. In other words, his eyes, the wine and the grape juice is representing Torah also. Why? You have Torah gladdens the heart, and also wine gladdens the heart. And wine all over the place is an allusion to Torah learning, specifically Torah learning. Before, with olive oil and the wisdom, is talking about allusion to wisdom. We have olive oil, and it lights the lamps, and it brings light. And this is really the Torah itself, right? And that's why, a skula for having smart children or children who are really Talmidei Chachamim is that you want to light your Friday night candles with olive oil. So over here, now this with the blood of grapes or the red-eyed from wine, this is now the next step, which is actually the learning of Torah. So what it says over there in the Midrash is that basically the right role of the king of Israel is he's supposed to be red-eyed from wine, which means his eyes are supposed to get so red from learning Torah that they're red as if he drank wine. And white-toothed from milk means that his teeth become white because they're always grinding out halachot with the Sanhedrin. And so over here in the last halacha, the way the Mishnah is constructed, it's talking about really these special trees of olives, and like there's no special wisdom like Torah, effectively. And over here, it's going to be talking about grapes, and it's going to get into this idea of that you should be so immersed in Torah learning, the learning of this special wisdom, that it's like your garments are stained with wine and your robe in blood of grapes, and your eyes are red from learning Torah. That's really what it's trying to say, says Midrash Rabbah Ruth. Now we're going to get into this with this aggadas thing of grapes, and then we're going to also be doing the practical halachot of grapes, right? But behind this, it's not accidental. And then in the end of it, it gets into all sorts of aggadas about how important it is to be following the derech of this way. Now, one of the other aggadas things that comes up in here is it says, do not move back the long-standing boundary. That's another aggadas thing that comes up in the Yerushalmi Shas and also in Midrash Rabbah, where they explain, do not move back the long-standing boundary can be read as literally moving back a brick wall or something in a field, but it also means do not go left or go right from the derech of Moshe Rabbeinu. That's why it's saying do not move back this long-standing boundary. So do not change the Torah, do not change the tradition. And by the way, later on it's going to get into, in this halacha, what happens when you have all these people that are modernizing the Torah, or they're changing the Torah, or coming up with new interpretations, or they're just not following it. Basically, they're changing the long-standing boundary, which is the boundary from Moshe Rabbeinu. So there's a lot of deep aggadas in here. This is not just a technical textbook of halachot. Let's start. So the Torah in Leviticus 19:10 commands somebody who owns a vineyard to grant the poor. They have two gifts, not just shkika and peah, but they also have two new gifts that are unique only to the grapevine. Here's what they are. One is Peret, and the other is Olelot. Okay? And these gifts are subject to everything that we're going to be doing now in this Mishnah. And the Mishnah is going to start by defining what is Peret. So here's what the Mishnah says. Mishnah says, what is Peret? And it says, it is that which falls during and because of the harvest. As he's severing this, let's say one grape becomes detached and falls when the cluster falls to the ground. That grape is going to be subject to Peret. Okay, so this is a unique to grapevines. And by the way, there's a couple of ways to qualify when does Peret start. Okay, so the Vilna Goan says in Shenas Eliyahu that Peret applies only to grapes that are detached from the cluster when the cluster reaches the ground. Okay, so he's saying that, first of all, everybody agrees that it has to be, you're in the process of harvesting it. You're actually physically doing it, okay? And it's shaking one loose. Now, when does it become Peret? According to the Vilna Goan and Sheni Eliyahu, it's when that cluster drops, hits the ground, and a grape pops off. That's when it is. By the way, that also echoes for halachot, for detaching in the laws of Shabbos, in the sugya talking about the detaching of a head of dates from a tree, like somebody throws a rock that's in the Bavli, and the question is when it falls, and when does this cluster detach? At what point does it detach? The way the detaching goes in chapter 7, halacha 2 of Masechet Shabbos, and that is going to basically, he's interpreting it, it's going to be at basically the same time. Then you have a third opinion by the Ravad, when it's actually during the act of removing the cluster from the vine. So you have the force going on this cluster, and that is what pops it off. Most of the Rishonim have a different opinion. They say it makes no difference whether the grapes are detached at that moment of removal or after the cluster reaches the ground. Okay, so there's three opinions. The Vilna Gaon says it's when it hits the ground. The Ravad says it's actually when the force of detaching that cluster. And the Rishonim say, most of the Rishonim say, that either when it's detached at that moment of removal or when the cluster hits the ground. So three different opinions on it. Mishnah is going to now get into more of it, and really the logical next conclusion is going to come up. What if some other force is basically causing it? Is that going to be Peret, right? So Mishnah is going to get into it, and it says, if one was harvesting grapes and he detached a cluster of grapes and it became entangled in the leaves and therefore fell to the ground and single grapes, in other words, Peret, was detached from it, the fallen grapes belong to the householder. In other words, it belongs the property of the owner of the vineyard. Why would that be? What is going on here? Basically, this is saying, when you look at the Rosh's explanation, Rosh, by the way, gives a really great commentary on the Mishnah. He's saying that Peret is limited to grapes that fall on the account of actual harvest. Okay, so that's a key thing to really get for what is happening here. It has to be part of the harvest process. Now, you can pick either the Vilna Gaon or one of the Rishonim and say, okay, does it happen when it hits the ground? It happen actually the cutting of it? Can it happen with either or? But all of them agree that it's actually this course of harvest. And the Rosh is saying that grain as Peret is to grapes, okay? The case of Leket, the verse states in 19:9 and 23:22 in Leviticus, it says that, and the leket of your harvest you shall not gather. And the Rosh is pointing out that the phrase the leket of your harvest implies that the law of leket is stated only with regards to gleanings that fall in a normal course of harvest. So now we're talking about this other thing, like the harvester drops it because of some external factor. Now, we actually had a sugya and a mishnah about this, like something pricked his finger and it caused the farmer to drop it. Okay, we also saw in the sugya that if he got scared and he drops it, that still remains, these gleanings still remain the property of the owner. So the same is going to be basically over here, because Peret is like, as the Rosh is pointing out, Peret is like leket, but leket is for grain, and over here, Peret is for grapes. Just like over there, if the guy has some external factor that causes it to be dropped, like he gets startled, or I don't know, he picks up his cell phone and he fumbles with it, and he drops it because he's handling his cell phone and he mishandles it, or let's say a bee stings him, or something happens, okay, and it's not the actual course of it, and something drops, that is still the property of the owner. Doesn't fall to the poor people. So now we're going to get into the next part. Okay, so a grape basically becomes Peret only if it falls in the act of harvesting. And since the fall of these grapes result from an outside thing, like the cluster became entangled in leaves, right? This entanglement and separation during entanglement, that's not active harvesting, so that's not going to be Peret. Okay, the Mishnah now is going to talk about a person who tries to prevent the poor from receiving Peret. So there's a lot of aggadah in Mishnah, and there's a lot of hidden things here. And it on the surface, it's going to look like a basic premise for halacha, but there's a lot of things going on under here. So if one places a basket beneath the grapevine when he harvests the grapes, and the basket prevents Peret grapes from reaching the ground, this person is robbing the poor. Now, here's where it says it. It says, about this, it is stated, do not move back the long-standing boundary. Now, we were talking about this statement, do not move back the long-standing boundary, as reading it as do not change the derech of Moshe Rabbeinu. Do not change the Metzorah, right? Jews are not supposed to behave this way. That's one way to interpret this, right? Jews are not supposed to cheat the poor. Jews are not supposed to do things in this like sleazy way where you're tricking the system, being like, okay, well, I know what the halacha is, right? I know that if it falls during harvesting and it hits the ground, that point, that's when it's going to be. So it's never going to hit the ground because I put a basket there. It didn't hit the ground, hit the basket, right? So it's mine. Okay, so that you would say is moving the long-standing boundary, right? Because Jews are not supposed to behave that way. You're not supposed to behave that way in your transactions. You're not supposed to try to cheat the Torah, trick the Torah. You're not supposed to make these rules like that, right? That's moving back the long-standing boundary. You're not supposed to have these modern interpretations. You're not supposed to look at modern orthodoxy. You're not supposed to look at, conservadox. All these things that move this tradition, you're not supposed to do it. Okay, that's really when you look in the explanation of this in the Midrash and other places in the Shas, in the Yerushalmi, that's how they're explaining this. Okay, it's this other way to read it. So one way to read this Mishnah is that this kind of person, this is not just stealing, but it's really the wrong way to behave. Okay, but this person is robbing the poor. This is a verse that appears twice in Proverbs, once in 22:28 and also in 23:10, and basically it's forbidding a person to annex some of the neighbor's property by being sneaky and moving the boundary marker on where it is. Okay, now we have a rule in Torah: you're not allowed to move the fence. Okay, you're not allowed to move a separation wall. The Mishnah here, the wording of the Mishnah is special here. It's using the term olam. It's as if it were written olim. Is written differently than the way it should be. The way it's being written, it's saying, do not move back the boundary of the ascending. It says the Tosfot Yom Tov. According to one view, the ascending refers to those who are ascending from Egypt, and the verse is basically telling us not to violate the law, the boundary of the Torah that was given to those who ascended from Egypt, in which is included the requirement of Peret. So here you can see from the Tosfot Yom Tov, the Mishnah is very precise and it knows very well what it's doing when it takes a word, and instead of writing it as olam, which is how it is written in the Tanakh, it's saying olim, the people ascending. Okay, so that is one way, and then the other way it can be interpreted. Again, we're talking about from the Tosfot Yom Tov. The ascending olim is a euphemism for those who have actually descended from their possessions and become poor. The verse is basically pleading with us against altering the regulations and the boundary that endow the poor with gifts. Another way to explain why this Mishnah is using this phrase. It's trying to teach us something. It's trying to teach you, hey, please do not. These people have, when it's using ascending, right? It's being nice. It's like calling somebody blind, full of light. Okay, and it's trying to say that you should be gracious with these people. They've ascended from their property, and instead of saying descended from their property, descended in social status, they've ascended from their property. They've risen above it. So you shouldn't be moving back the boundary and preventing them from their rights and their gifts. The Mishnah now is going to get into the law of Olelos. And now it says, what are Olelos? And an Olelos is any cluster of grapes that has neither shoulder nor dripping. Basically, any cluster that lacks both of these characteristics, they have to be left to the poor. Now, what is that going to be? And I'll explain it. It says, if, however, the cluster has neither shoulder nor dripping, it belongs to the owner of the vineyard. If there's a doubt as to whether the cluster possesses these characteristics, it belongs to the poor. So we're talking about Olelos and it's talking about shoulder and dripping. This is describing the density of the grapes. Shoulder is describing the density of the grapes. That's basically the wide part of the cluster. And dripping is referring to the narrow tapered end. Go to the grocery store, go look at grapes in the grocery store. You'll see that by the stem at the very, very top of the cluster, it's going to be much wider, and then there'll be only like one or two grapes at the very, very end. So the shoulder is going to be the top part, and the dripping is going to be at the narrow part. Now, both of these characteristics are going to be judged for underdevelopment, and that is going to be left to the poor. We're going to get more into the full explanation of these characteristics in the Gemara, but basically, the Rambam in Matanos Aniyim is saying only one of these two characteristics is required for a cluster to remain the property of the owner. And the key word here, as what the Rambam is saying, is this connective letter Vav. Okay, in this Mishnah is pointing to and it means that it has to have both this and that. It has to have both the shoulder and the dripping characteristic in order to qualify for Olelos. And if it only has one of these two characteristics, it stays the property of the owner. That is the commentary in the Mishnah by the Rambam. In the verse, and you shall not harvest the Olelos of your vineyard, the term Olelos is related to Olel, which is a child. And so it's referring to these clusters that have not fully developed. They are as children in comparison to the other fully developed clusters. That's the note by the Rambam. Here's the deal, right? In all of these cases, all right, everything in this Masechet, if there's going to be a doubt, okay, it's going to favor the poor in the case of doubt. But you say, wait a second, we just learned that this is supposed to favor the owner. Okay, in those cases, those are not cases of doubt. Those are cases of property. So now, we're talking about like the law of Bet Hillel with sheaves, right? So it says, okay, why is it like Bet Hillel, where it says that you have two in a row, that those are going to be sheaves that can be forgotten. Those can be forgotten. The third one, if you have three in a row that are forgotten, that's going to favor the owner. Okay, and then Bet Shammai is going to have that it has to be four in a row. So you say, okay, well we know that Bet Hillel is proving that it's two from the Torah. It's Doraita. Okay, they're looking at the verse to prove it. But then you say to yourself, but why is it still going to be three in a row? And they're going to say, look, the three in a row, not only is it proved in the Halacha, but this is also a case where it favors the owner because there's not a doubt. This is the law, and the law itself is going to be three. And this is going to be a case where if you're forgetting, three in a row, which is going to be the minimum size for a row, is three. And so the law itself follows what the Torah is saying, and that's really showing that in a case with no doubt, that is going to follow and favor the landowner. But in all the cases of doubt where it's not clear, it's going to belong to the poor, it's going to favor the poor. That's a very big distinction in Masechet Peah to keep in mind. Mara Fulda is saying that when you have a branch laden with many fully developed clusters of grapes, and occasionally there's going to be some of these Olelot as well, okay, and when they're presented with these kinds of branches, the landowner, will often save labor at the harvest by severing the entire branch at once rather than detaching each cluster separately. The Mishnah is ruling that if, when the branch is severed, it contains Olelot as well as full clusters, the Olelot remain the property of the landowner. Okay, but although the Olelot grow separately from the fully developed clusters, they are considered to be as one with them since they are harvested together. And therefore, says the Tosfot Yom Tov, these Olelot are not given to the poor. But if, however, says the Mara Fulda, if the severed branch contains only clusters but no Olelot, the Olelot remaining behind and left on the vine are regarded as independent of the clusters, even though they were once connected to them. And hence, like the other Olelot, those are left to the poor. And that's what it's saying about this case of doubt. There's another interpretation by the Ravad. Ravad is saying that in the Mishnah's case, possible Olelot and a full cluster emerges from the same point, the owner must determine whether the Olelot is part of the cluster, in which case it belongs to him, or whether it is independent from the branching, in which case it belongs to the poor. And this determining is calculated whether the undeveloped cluster will come off with the primary cluster when the primary clusters are torn from the branch. If it will come off when the cluster is when it too is part of the cluster, it belongs to the landowner. But if the undeveloped cluster will remain attached to the branch when the primary cluster is removed, it is an independent entity, and when it's an independent entity, those are Olelot and those are left to the poor. The Rambam points out that his commentary on this in Matanos Aniyim, chapter 4, halacha 20, this is talking about a fork in a tree branch, and the adjoining cluster grows on the branch that stems from this fork or this knot, and the Olelot grow from the knot itself. And when you separate the branch, one cuts it at the point of the knot or the fork, and if the Olelot are removed from the branch, it is part of the cluster and belongs to the owner and remains on the vine. But if it remains on the vine, it is an independent entity and belongs to the poor. If it's being cut off as part of the harvest, where it's connected to all these other good grapes, it stays the property of the owner because it's done in a single harvest. Okay, the Torah is not going to go require him to do an inefficient harvesting process where he has to go pick through all of these vines and look out for these Olelot, these clusters that are around and immature. They're saying, no, nobody's going to do it that way. Torah is not going to cause you to lose money like that. It's going to say, look, if you're harvesting the whole branch by cutting it off and there's some Olelot in there, those are the property of the rich. But all these other ones that are left there, even if it was connected and you separated it out, that now where it gets separated, even though it was connected and you've separated on the other side of it, okay, that now is going to stay to the property of the poor because that's a case of doubt. That's a case of doubt, says what like the Rambam would say, right? It's not sure whether that cluster that was once very close to it could have cut it on the other side of it, right? Could have cut it on the other side of these Olelot, and it would have all been part of the branch. Now you're cutting it on the other side, the closer side to the end of it, and you're getting more of this. Would this cluster here remain the property of the poor or the owner? And so at that case, you're saying, oh, that would belong to the poor, and it's going to favor the poor. I just want to note another point by the Tosfot Yom Tov, where it's saying that, in this Mishnah, if there is doubt as to whether a cluster possesses these characteristics, it belongs to the poor. This is following, the rule early in the Mishnah that, with leket, namely with questionable leket, it is deemed leket. So that's a important thing to keep in mind. Normally, by the way, in monetary law, somebody who's trying to take property from someone else, they have to give the burden of proof. Okay, so under this principle, questionable leket should seem to remain the property of the landowner, and that's why these verses are cited in this earlier Gemara in here, is to teach us that in the case of leket and other gifts to the poor, the usual rule does not apply. Rather, all doubts here are going to be resolved in the favor of the poor. Now, you could say, why would the property favor the poor in the case of a doubt? And you could reply and say, oh, because the Torah guarantees these as rights to the poor. And so you could say, because this is divinely guaranteed, in cases of doubt, it would fall to the property of poor. So in normal property rights, you have to, bear the burden of proof to take property away from somebody. But this is a special case because the Torah is specially giving this right, and this is going to override that normal monetary thing. So that's another way to look at this. Now, let's get to the last part of this Mishnah, and it says, in the case of a cluster composed of numerous single grapes, Rabbi Yehuda says it is a cluster, not Olelot, and therefore it belongs to the owner. But the sages says it is Olelot and it belongs to the poor. So here's what the Rosh is saying about this Mishnah. He's saying that the Mishnah refers to a cluster formed of single grapes whose stems attach directly to a central stalk of the cluster rather than to the secondary branches stemming from the central stalk. And because these single grapes are closely spaced, the cluster appears to have a shoulder and dripping, but in fact does not possess these characteristics, and therefore the sages rule that it is given to the poor. Rabbi Yehuda is going to give us a scriptural verse to teach that any close grouping of more than 3 grapes, even if it has neither a shoulder nor dripping, is not going to be considered Olelot. And he's going to rule that a cluster of many individual grapes is not going to be Olelot and remains the property of the poor. And the Gemara later is going to give Rabbi Yehuda's source for that, but that's not how the sages rule. So let's get into the Gemara. Gemara now is talking about what the Mishnah talked about. If the owner places a basket beneath the vines to catch Peret grapes, and he robs the poor. And the Gemara is now going to talk about this ruling. So the Gemara doesn't start off talking about the part where it's talking about what is Peret. It doesn't talk about the harvesting part. It goes past all of that. It assumes that what it was talking about in the Mishnah is very thorough, and it doesn't want to discuss it. Instead, it wants to say that, okay, this you can understand on the shot. This is basically what it is. Let's go to the robbing of the poor part. Okay? So basically the Gemara, by skipping all that, is saying, hey, go look at this Mishnah for those first parts of it, because that is pretty clear. So here's how the Gemara reads. The Gemara reads, this tells us that Peret becomes consecrated to the poor from when it falls, even before it reaches the ground. Otherwise, the Mishnah would not describe the placing of the basket as robbery. So here's how the Rosh Cirilio understands it. Okay, it says the question at issue is whether the Peret grapes belong to the poor from the moment they fall or from the moment they reach the ground. The Gemara is trying to demonstrate from the Mishnah that it's when they reach the ground. And were it otherwise, the Mishnah would not describe the placing of the basket as robbing the poor, since the grapes do not belong to the poor until they reach the ground. Since the Mishnah does categorize this act as robbery, it eventually holds that when they fall, the grapes are the property of the poor. Now keep in mind, the opinion of the Vilna Goan is when it hits the ground. Okay, these he's saying are the grapes that detach. When this cluster hits the ground, boom, property of the poor, according to the Vilna Goan. Now, they're saying, no, you put a basket on there, it doesn't hit the ground, hits the basket, it broke off, but it didn't hit the ground. So you're saying, hey, I have my trick here. So that's what they're going to be talking about as robbery. Okay, and you should see very quickly, yeah, this is robbery. You've taken away the rights of the poor. Okay, poor is allowed to come collect it. They're allowed to gather it together, and why can't they make some wine for Shabbos also? Okay, so the Gemara is going to talk about this ruling to resolve, a question on leket. Okay, so here's how the Gemara reads. The Gemara says, does this not resolve the question raised by Hilfi? For Hilfi asked, with regard to leket becoming consecrated to the poor upon its falling from the harvester's hand, what is the law? So, okay, so Rosh Cirilio says that Hilfi is the Amara known in the Bavli as Ilfa. Sometimes in the Yerushalmi you'll see somebody called Ilfa. That's also going to be Hilfi. So this is talking about an Amara. And so this Amara is asking about, when leket becomes consecrated to the poor, when it falls, is that it? What is the law? Basically it's saying that, leket, like Peah, should become the property of the poor at the moment it falls from the owner's hand, even before it reaches the ground. Okay? So here's how the Mara Fulda explains it. Mara Fulda says, leket refers to the stalks of grain that fall at the time of reaping, and Chilfi is wondering when it is that the fallen grain becomes leket, and thus the property of the poor. Does it become leket immediately upon falling from the owner's hand or sickle, or is it leket status until it actually hits the ground? The Gemara is suggesting that since leket is to grain what Peret is to grapes, its law should be derived from Peret. So, accordingly, just as Peret becomes property of the poor the moment it falls, so too should leket become the property of the poor the moment it falls. So, Chilfi's question here, by the way, it comes up in the Bavli in Tamora 25a, and I know that because I'm actually working on Tamora right now in the Bavli. And it also comes up in Trumos in chapter 6, Halacha 2. And privately, I'm also working in Trumos right now. So that's where you can find Hilfi's comments there. And the Bavli, by the way, points out a different version of this question. So you can check it out on page 25a. So that's what it's trying to figure out. It's trying to figure out, at what point do leket become the property of the poor? At what point does Peret going to become property of the poor? And the question, the Gemara is now gonna look at this statement regarding Peret and offer a different rationale for why this mission is going to describe a basket placed beneath the vine as robbery. In other words, it's saying that no, maybe it's like what these other Rishonim are saying, that no, this act of cutting the vine and harvesting it, and a grape falls off from that point, okay, which is what a lot of the Rishonim rule, by the way, that this is the point where Peret occurs. And so it's saying that if it occurs like this, when it's falling from the hand with this force of harvesting where you're cutting it, okay, then, and it didn't hit the ground yet, but it will hit the ground, okay, so it's basically saying that, it's basically assuming that, hey, maybe it's happening when you're actually cutting it from the vine before it hits, okay? So it's going to come and defend this point of view from the basket as if it's actually from the cutting and not from the landing of the grapes on the ground and then detaching and becoming. So Rabbi Shmuel Bar of Udma says in the Gemara, even if Peret and leket do not become property of the poor until they actually reach the ground, the act of placing a basket beneath the vine can still be characterized as robbing the poor. The Gemara goes on to say, for it is different in the case of the basket. For by placing the basket beneath the vines, the owner caused the grapes not to descend to the ground. So basically, what this is trying to say that through his actions, the poor are denied of Peret. So because you're denying him of Peret, taking it away, basically you could say it's like somebody who's robbing the poor, even though the Peret did not actually become the owner of the poor yet. You've denied him the ability to get it. You've taken that away from him. So the Gemara here, according to the Mara Fulda, is saying that the Gemara is answering that while it is true that the law of leket parallels that of Peret, it is not at all certain that Peret itself becomes a property of the poor from the moment it falls. Now, in leket, it does, but not necessarily for Peret. It may, says Marafulda, it may well be that it does not become the property of the poor until the Peret reaches the ground, which is, by the way, what the Vilna Goan says, right? So, although the Mishnah describes one who places a basket beneath the vine as robbing the poor, it is possible that the Mishnah does not literally mean that he has violated the prohibition against theft. Rather, the Mishnah is borrowing the term to express that grievous financial harm this person can visit upon the poor. And by placing the basket beneath the tree and preventing the grapes from reaching the ground, this person is keeping the poor from acquiring the grapes as Peret. And he is only an indirect cause of their loss, but nonetheless, the Mishnah is characterizing him as one who robs the poor. We saw this kind of thing before, with avak loshen hara, right? It's not direct loshen hara, but it's avak loshen hara. It's the dust of loshen hara. They're saying the same thing. By the way, there's also avak avodah zarah, right? It has the dust of avodah zarah on it. And so here it's saying it has avak for theft, right? It's not literally stealing it, but he's causing a loss. And that's basically being regarded by the Chachamim as theft. This, by the way, is not disputed that it's theft, okay? Everybody agrees with it. There's no maloket on it, okay? Even if it's going to be looked at as an indirect cause, everybody agrees it's theft, and it's immoral and it's wrong, okay? So, and the Mishnah is categorizing him as a robber, okay? So, I just want to point out that according to the Tosfot Anshe Shem, he's saying that the Mishnah is teaching that although he means no harm, okay, he doesn't mean any harm by putting the basket there. He's prohibited under rabbinic law to place his basket beneath the vines, lest some of the Peret fall into the basket, causing him to inadvertently violate the prohibition against theft. So there's going to be a question about whether this is going to be a deraita theft or a derabanan theft, where you could say, okay, well, he's trying to put this basket under. Look, biblically, there's a prohibition against stealing, and there's a prohibition biblically against withholding Peret from the poor. You're not allowed to do that. But you could say, because again, it gets back into this avak question, right? You could say, oh, well, in the case where the owner's intention by placing the basket, underneath there is honorable, and some of the, Peret falls in, he wasn't trying to do a deraita, violation. He was trying to have a more efficient work process, and a couple of grapes fell in, right? And so you could say that, the Mishnah is trying to teach that, even if he doesn't mean any harm, he's still prohibited, even under rabbinic law, to place the basket under the vines, because if some of these Peret clusters fall into the basket, it's gonna cause him to inadvertently violate the prohibition against theft, and you're not allowed to do that even inadvertently. Okay, you have to be so careful with theft, especially with things that are not really obvious like theft, but here it's an inadvertent case where some of these grapes fell in and you've basically taken them. So you have a big problem. So it emerges that we cannot definitely demonstrate from this Mishnah that Peret becomes the property of the poor when either from when it leaves the owner's hand, but it also can't resolve Hilfi's question on this Mishnah. So it's unclear whether it's going to be like most of the Rishonim when it's actually cut, or whether it's going to be like what the Vilna Goan is saying when it's landing, or whether it's going to be like what the Ravad says, where the Ravad says, hey, it could be either when it's cut or landing and pops off. Okay, so unclear exactly at which point, but everybody agrees that it's actually from the act of harvesting. Okay, so that's the other key thing to keep in mind. Mishnah stated, what are Olelos? And basically, Olelos, says the Gemara, is any cluster of grapes that has neither shoulder nor dripping. Now, the Gemara is going to cite a brisa that's going to define these terms. What are shoulders and dripping? So Gemara says, the brisa says, if the cluster has shoulder but not dripping, dripping but not shoulder, it belongs to the owner of the vineyard. And if there is a doubt as to whether the cluster possesses these characteristics, it belongs to the poor. And what is meant by shoulder? It refers to a cluster that has smaller clusters lying one on top of the next. And what is meant by dripping? It refers to grapes that hang downward on the tip of a central stalk. So here's how the Mara Fulda is explaining it. Mara Fulda is saying a normal cluster of grapes comes to a narrow and a tapered end. And beyond a central point, the central stalk no longer branches off into secondary clusters. Rather, the grapes grow from individual stems directly attached to a central stalk. Thus, a full cluster of grapes is formed from numerous secondary clusters around the central branch, and a branch of grapes growing directly from one end of the central branch. The grapes that grow at the tip of the central branch all hang downwards, resembling drops of liquid dripping down, and therefore this bottommost branch is known as nataf, which is dripping. If a cluster of grapes does not include this tapered bottommost branch growing directly from the end of the central stalk, the cluster is said to lack dripping, and if it lacks a shoulder as well, it is Olelot, and it belongs to the poor. So the Rosh is saying, alternatively, dripping refers to the density of grapes at the bottom of the central stalk, and if the grapes are touching so that one appears to be dripping onto its fellow, the cluster has the characteristics of dripping, and if the grapes are widely spaced, the cluster lacks this characteristics. There's another interpretation of shoulder and dripping, and here's what the Rosh says about from Torah's Kohanim. It says, according to the interpretations offered by shoulder and dripping, they refer to different aspects of the cluster, and those both characteristics can be present in a single cluster. So in this view by the Rosh, it says both terms concern the density of the second branches along the length of a central stem, and the Rosh explains that there are two basic types of grape cluster. In some clusters, the secondary branches are short and branch off into numerous individual stems, and each containing a grape, or other fully developed clusters of the type. These secondary branches are plentiful, and these mini clusters press against another and completely obscure the view of the central stalk. So that's another way to read it. So the Mishnah now is going to state that clusters of grapes that lack both the shoulder and dripping, okay, are Olelot. And Gemara is going to qualify this ruling. Rabbi Ba said in the name of Rabbi Yehuda, and this is stated only where all the grapes of the underdeveloped cluster will come into contact with the palm of the hand when placed on it. In other words, he's saying if the cluster is too large or too dense for this, then even if it lacks a shoulder and dripping, it is not going to be Olelot, and it remains a property of the landowner. Okay, so basically, says the Mara Fulda, the Gemara is adding these further details to help refine and hone in on this definition of Olelot. It's saying one part is this underdeveloped cluster must be small enough to fit in a person's hand, says the Mara Fulda, and the second part, he says, is that its grapes must be so sparsely distributed that when one placed it on one's hand, each and every grape on the cluster will come into contact with the hand. If, however, the cluster is too large to fit into the person's hand, or too densely populated with grapes to allow every grape to touch the hand, it is not going to be an Olelot. And basically, it's going to lack both shoulder and dripping, says the Mara Fulda. So that's a more technical way to try to read this and understand it. And the Gemara is gonna get into this ruling and dispute it. Rabbi Chia says otherwise. He says, for he recounted the following event. There was an incident in which they weighed a single Olelot and its weight came out to 7 litra in Sipori. Now, keep in mind, the Siporian measurements are larger than ordinary measurements. It just is. And the lira up in Sipori is going to be bigger than the ordinary litra down in Jerusalem. So basically what they're saying is it's impossible for a single Olelot of this weight to fit in a person's palm. And clearly, Olelot can be larger than the palm of one hand. So, maybe that's going to be, a contradiction. You can look up the weights for a litra and in both the north and in the south, and they're not going to be the same. And you can check. There's some commentary on why it has differences. So Rabbi Hanania said the rule is, says Gemara, that if a person places the undeveloped cluster onto a writing tablet, it will be considered an Olelot only if all the grapes will come in contact with the tablet. If, however, the cluster is too large or dense for this, it is not going to be Olelot and it does not belong to the poor. So the Mara Fulda explains with this sugya, says that with this, the Gemara retracts its previous ruling regarding the maximum size of Olelot, and instead of requiring that it measure no more than the size of a person's hand, the Gemara is ruling that an Olelot may be as large as a writing tablet, which is, of a standard size back in the Talmud times, but no larger. And, its grapes must be sufficiently sparse that each and every one touches the surface of the tablet. So I want to point out an explanation by the Rambam here, because he's reading this a little bit differently. The Rambam in Matanos Aniyim, chapter 4, Halacha 18, is saying that the Gemara's answer that on the palm of the hand, was never intended to be a measure of size, for in fact there is no maximum size for Olelot. Rather, the Gemara is focused on the density of the grapes of the cluster, and the Gemara rules whether the size of an Olelot for its grapes must be sparse enough to be distributed that all grapes can touch the surface of where they lie. In other words, says the Mara Fulda, to help us to explain it, he's saying that when the grapes, in these cases of Olelot, sit on a writing tablet, but it's where it's trying to say that whether it's as big as a hand or as big as a tablet, says the Pnei Moshe, that its grapes must be sparse enough that each and every one comes into contact with the item on which it rests. And basically, in the Rambam's view, he's saying that Olelot can be any size at all. So these, whether it's going to be the person's palm or the writing tablet, certainly writing tablet's going to be bigger. Really, the way the Rambam or Pnei Moshe's understanding it is saying that no, look at the density of the grapes. Don't look at the size of it. Don't look at the size of the writing tablet as a measurement. This is just like a hekesh as an example, right? But it could be, the palm of a hand, right? It could be something else. But that itself is not a measurement tool. Really look at the density of the grapes. That's really the point. So the Gemara is gonna teach a ruling concerning Olelot, and here's how the Gemara reads. It says, if it happened that a Levi acquired Meiser Rishon that was Tevel, in other words, Trumas Meiser that had not yet been separated, had it separated out, okay? The Gemara reads, and he found in the Meiser Rishon Olelot. He may designate the Meiser Rishon containing these Olelot as Truma Meiser for untithed Meiser Rishon produce in another location. Now that is going to be a really, really key point. That's a really deep insight. In other words, the Levi, he gets these all these grape clusters, and in there he finds some Olelot. There's some Olelot in there, and as a Trumas Meiser, he can for Trumas Meiser he can designate all the untithed Meiser Rishon grapes even the Olelos as Truma Meiser onto other untithed Meiser Rishon grapes that he owns. Now, definitely, this is now going to be moving up in quality. That's what's so surprising about that, right? So he's taking these underdeveloped ones, these Olelos, and he's moving it up in quality. Now, keep in mind that this must have been harvested from a branch that was connected with other very good grapes, right? We're not talking about stolen Olelos, right? This is just that he found a a cluster of Olelot that is in there, and that is very surprising because he's basically moving it up the ladder. So basically, once this is done, the tevel designation is going to be removed from both sets of grapes, and those mixed with the Olelos become Truma Meiser and are given to the cone, and the others become permitted for consumption. So without this ruling, one might have thought that the Olelos are the property of the poor and unfit to be used by a Levi as Truma Meiser, right? That's really what's surprising about it. But the Gemara is actually ruling that they can be used in this purpose. Now, why is the Gemara's case is that where you have the Meiser grapes with Olelos, and they're being designated as Trumas Meiser on other Meiser grapes. Presumably, one would be permitted also to separate out the Olelos from the grapes that came with, and designate the Olelos alone as Truma Meiser on those very grapes. So it's a very surprising case. So the Gemara is now going to question this ruling, and it's going to say, but are the Olelos not the property of the poor? And of course they are. There's no dispute about that. So the Levi should not be permitted to designate them as Truma Meiser. That's really what it's asking. Now let's look at the Rosh Cirilio. Rosh Cirilio says the Olelos as gifts to the poor are themselves exempt from tithes, so one cannot fulfill the Truma requirement with produce upon which there's no Truma obligation. That is a deep point. Mara Fulda also says, he says, one cannot fulfill the Truma requirement of one's own produce with the produce belonging to another, right? It doesn't belong to you. So Gemara is asking that since these Olelos belong to the poor, the Levi should not be able to use them as Truma and Meiser for his other produce. And if he does, both the grapes containing the Olelos and the untied Meiser Rishon in the other location would remain as tevel. It's a very surprising statement. And now the Gemara is going to explain this ruling, and so that there'll be no question. So here's what it says. It says, Rabbi Avin said in the name of the rabbis in that place, Babylonia, whenever Olelos are found among the harvested grapes, I may say that they are of those that were severed during the fully developed clusters. Thus, they are property of the owner, not the poor, and therefore Levi may designate them as Truma Meiser. So that really is the only way to rationalize what just happened. In other words, you had the vine, you had a lot of branches, and you had a lot of really good clusters in those branches. And there's one or two that are Olelos. He intended to harvest the good ones. He severed off that branch, and inside are a couple of Olelos. And so now you're saying, hey, you can take this and separate it out for the other one. Now, it's also going to be a surprising ruling because you're not supposed to you're supposed to give truma on the best of your crops, and you're not really supposed to take lower quality and then do it off of lower quality. So that's really a surprising thing. Perhaps it's saying that if you did it and you did it, is it going to be trumas meiser retroactively? Yes, but it's really not the right way to do it. But halacha meiser, would it be retroactively? Yeah. So there can be that. There's a case in Masechet Trumas where if you separated out wine and on one half for another half, and the one that you were separating, you saw turn to vinegar, and you were separating out Truma Meiser on another half on another location that was wine, you're not really allowed to do that because you're not allowed to make Truma separations on lower quality product. But if you did, the ruling is that it is a halachic truma, but you're not supposed to do it on inferior produce. So perhaps that's what's happening here. Would it be retroactively? Yes. Would it be halacha lemaisa? Yes, but that's not what you're supposed to do. And in fact, you may get punished for separating inferior produce, because that is a punishment too. So it might be after the fact truma meiser, but it's not really the right way to do it. The Mishnah states, in the case of a cluster composing numerous single grapes, the Mishnah informs us that, according to Rabbi Yehuda, such a cluster is not going to be subject to Olelot, but according to the sages, they are going to be subject to Olelot. And now the Gemara is going to give Rabbi Yehuda's source. Rabbi Simon said, Rabbi Simon said, Rabbi Yehuda's reasoning is from this verse, which speaks of a tree whose fruit has been harvested. It says from Isaiah 17:6, it says, and there shall be left upon it Olelot, like one who harvests an olive tree and leaves 2 or 3 single fruits at the top of the highest point of the tree. This verse identifies Olelot with 2 or 3 single fruits, which implies that more than this number is not Olelot, but a cluster. So this is basically going to be the source of Rabbi Yehuda's ruling. It's also, by the way, interesting that he's not picking something in the Chumash, he's picking something in the Tanakh to learn this. So that's going to be a little bit interesting, right? So the Gemara is going to talk about a series of incidents that demonstrate the extraordinary quality of the fruits of Israel in earlier times. And now we're going to get into all these points about how the quality diminished. And there was an incident, and Rabbi Abahu says in this Gemara, Rabbi Yosei ben Chanina and Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish passed by the Doron vineyard. The Pnei Moshe says that the Doron vineyard could either be the name of a vineyard, or it was given because it was owned by somebody named Doron, or because it was located in a place named Doron. So there's 3 ways to look at that, says the Pnei Moshe. And a certain sharecropper, says the sugya, brought them out a single peach, and it was so large that they and their donkey drivers ate their fill, and they still had some left over. So, and they estimated that this peach was as large as a frying pan of kafar Hananya, which can hold a seah of lentils. Seah is gonna be about 45 pounds. Like, it's gonna weigh about 45 pounds, and it's gonna measure either 2.25 gallons if you were to fill it up, or 4.5 gallons. But if you were to measure out a seah of grain, it would be about 45 pounds. It's basically a 45 pound peach. By the way, in the Bavli, they talk about this frying pan as being 5 seah. So after some time, they went past this place again, and the sharecropper brought them out 2 or 3 peaches from his hand, and they were looking at how small they were, and they said, we want the peach from the tree that provided that large peach that we had last time. And he said to them, these are from that tree. And they applied the following verse to the tree. They said, God turns a fruitful land into a salty waste because of the evil and sins of its inhabitants. And they said that the diminishment of the fruit was because of the sins of the owners of the tree. Basically, says the Mara Fulda, they assumed that these tiny peaches must be from a different tree, and they requested that they provide from the same tree as last time. I want to point out a note. So, why would they have such big frying pans for lentils, like in Kfar Hananya? And there's a dish that's talked about in the Yerushalmi Shas where they used to fry lentils, and then they would grind the lentils up, and they would mix it with honey and spices, and then they would basically make them into falafel balls and fry them. And my wife and I tried this recipe from the Yerushalmi, and it was delicious. Anyway, so that's why you'd have these giant frying pans. Could be this was a dish that they were eating back then, and so that's why they would be trying to roast such a large quantity of lentils, is basically to make this local kind of falafel from back then. Anyway, this, by the way, is a deep aggadic thing, talking about why it's so important to immerse yourself in Torah. These people became filled with sin, and because they became filled with sin, the quality of their work and their produce went down, and it got cursed by Hashem. And we have to stick to Torah learning because we have to be good and we have to be virtuous. And the only way to go in the way of Hashem and to know Hashem is to know the details of the law and is to guard the law. And the only way to guard the law is to know the details of the law. And that's why we have to know about Olelot. That's why we have to know about how it works with Peret, why it matters to study these details, because if you're not doing it, you're going to be an Am Haaretz and you're going to make mistakes. And it says in both Shas's, all of the misfortunes of the world come because of those who are unlearned in Torah. So these poor people, these fools who had these amazing trees and they were virtuous at one time, went down in their spiritual level. Maybe they became modern. Maybe they got smartphones. Maybe they started to look at things they shouldn't have done, and they started to get funny ideas, and they didn't have clean thinking, and all of the blessing was taken away from them. And these people could see it visually from when they were first there, and then much later when they came back, and the same trees were producing little, because their spiritual quality went down. As it says, God turns a fruitful land into a salty waste because of the evil and sins of its inhabitants. So how careful do we have to be to really stick to Torah? And that's why it's talking about Torah learning and grapes. And this is an aggadic thing to be showing us with the rest of this, because the rest of the sugya talks about, the rest of the halachas talk about good Jews who are going to follow the Torah and what happens when you don't, what happens to the land, what happens to your produce, what happens to your parnassah. So this is not here by accident, and it's really amazing how the sages organized this and structured it. Thank you.